The GTX 1080 was one heck of a card when it came out, more powerful than the 980 Ti and Maxwell Titan X, and with prices now on the decline for Pascal, something we predicted a while back on account of cryptocurrency mining decline and the release of Turing, the 1080 is actually looking pretty sweet, especially when seen in the context of those Turing launch prices. So if you aren't interested in paying more than say $400, I don't blame you. This card can still handle nearly anything you throw at it, even in 4K. But what about the GTX 1070 Ti? This card hasn't gotten as much love lately, and I have a theory as to why, but I first want to compare the two from a performance perspective and assess prices so that you can make the most informed purchase decision possible in this category, because these cards right here are among some of the best bang for the buck cards you can currently buy. This matchup was a fun one, and I took an interesting approach because I've heard so many things along the lines of, oh, a custom 1070 Ti can match a stock 1080, and I've always wanted to test this firsthand. So I took the EVGA GTX 1080 SC using a reference PCB that I purchased from eBay for $300, more on that right here, and slung it head to head against our beefy 3-slot GTX 1070 Ti for the win. Both of these cards are from EVGA, but only the 1070 Ti again boasts a custom add-in board. The 1080 here utilizes the reference design, so it won't have any power delivery and overclocking advantages, save the possible thermal advantages associated with a third-party cooler, though the Founders Edition coolers are actually pretty effective. Both of these cards are extremely quiet and cool, and that's another reason to go with an aftermarket cooler. EVGA does an excellent job in general with both custom and reference boards. I've never had a problem to date, but where do you think these two fall on the leaderboard? Obviously the 1070 Ti is going to be a little weaker than the 1080, but does the price difference there justify the gap in performance? Let's find out. So the platform I used for benchmarking both of these cards was my personal gaming rig, sporting a Core i7-8700K, 16 gigs of DDR4, and a modest overclock of 4.8 gigahertz. It's a pretty, hardcore gaming rig. If you want the best of the best in terms of gaming, then the 8700K is the best one to buy right now. Everything else remained unchanged throughout these tests, and the graphics cards themselves were not manually overclocked past their out-of-the-box frequencies. So first game up was Grand Theft Auto 5. This one was tested in 1440p with maxed out settings across the board, save a 4x anti-aliasing scale. And what you're looking at here are frame times pertaining to the last scene in the built-in benchmark. Frame times are the inverse of FPS, so everything above this line indicates an FPS reading below 60, which is what we don't want. We averaged about 79 FPS for the GTX 1080 and around 68 FPS for the 1070 Ti. Keep in mind that the Ti has an advantage here thanks to its custom PCB and higher load tolerances, so if we benchmark two Founders Edition cards, for example, we should expect a slightly larger gap between them. Now I'm choosing to show frame time graphs instead of FPS charts because these provide slightly more insight into the raw frame spikes, something you wouldn't otherwise see with 1% and 0.1% low graphs. Things became less consistent over here, and we'd never get to see these variances with, again, those other charts. The 1070 Ti falls slightly behind across the board and sports slightly higher frame time spikes, something remember we want to see less of. We want more consistent, flat, and low lines on this chart. I would like to point out, however, that the two games are nearly impossible to distinguish at this resolution, and with these presets, without the FPS counters, it'd be like a 50-50 toss-up. So the decision between the 1070 Ti and 1080 here would ultimately come down to pricing and availability, simply because you can't really see the difference between the two in the real world. We'll show these tests with other games later in the video. The next game tested was F1 2017. Funny enough, this game appeared much more stable than this graph depicts, and that's again why this graph is so important to show. A majority of this benchmark for both cards yielded flat and reliable frame times. However, several intermittent instances resulted in render times approaching 25 milliseconds. That's roughly 40 FPS. Now, after the beginning of the benchmark, we see things level off significantly, with only a few spikes pushing that 60 FPS barrier at 16.7 milliseconds. Overall though, the GTX 1080 averaged about 94 FPS, with the 1070 Ti only a few frames behind at 86. Up next is PUBG, and this, folks, is what an unoptimized game looks like with respect to frame times. These large spikes are indicative of extreme and random lags in-game, amounting to nearly a fourth of 1 second at times, which sounds insignificant, I know, but I can assure you it makes a world of difference in a game like this. It's the difference between being shot and shooting at somebody else. So this test was conducted with medium presets, mind you, save a reduction in foliage and a boost in draw distance. This is just how I play the game. The average frame rates for both cards were actually pretty good though. The 1080 pushed out around 122 FPS here, while the 1070 Ti managed 109. Yet the Ti struggled quite a bit more at times to maintain this average, which again is why a chart like this is so important in the grand scheme of things. It just helps you visualize those random lags a bit better. I tested Rise of the Tomb Raider as kind of a last hurrah before moving over to Shadow of the Tomb Raider for testing purposes, and I was sure to run it in DirectX 12 to throw these cards a curveball. DX12 runs like an absolute dog in this game, and we see that indicated vaguely by the minimums across all three instances for both cards. It actually appears as though the GTX 1080 struggled slightly more in this regard, though I couldn't run the frame time counters using Fraps because the software isn't compatible as an overlay with the DirectX 12 API. I'll show a side-by-side comparison a little later. Lastly, we have Witcher 3, always a great graphics card limiter thanks to its dynamic setting and array of in-game features. We were bottlenecked by our graphics cards for sure in both scenarios, at which point the gap between both cards became extremely narrow. We managed just over 60 FPS, that threshold there, in both cases, with the GTX 1080 pulling just a couple of frames ahead on average at 64. Had we enabled Hairworks, for example, we'd have seen these frame rates drop into the mid-40s. There were a few spikes here and there for both runs, but in general, I'd call this one a tie. The differences here are just too small to accurately measure. Now I want to throw up side-by-side comparisons of both cards running the games we've benchmarked in order to make my next point. If you're worried about the tiny deltas between these two on paper, don't be. There's really no reason to be. In all honesty, I'll be throwing the 1070 Ti back into my personal rig so I can run future tests between the 1080 and 2080, and I can say for certain that I won't miss the 1080. There's really no noticeable difference. They're so close in many instances that you aren't likely to notice which card is running on which side. Go ahead, take a guess which one of these scenes was rendered by the GTX 1080. Think you got the answer? Here's the right answer. And if you got it right, you might have guessed. Even if I had left frame counters on screen, you'd be hard pressed to distinguish between the two, and that's why the GTX 1070 Ti is a great value proposition in the new market. Inventory levels for these cards are still extremely high, so prices are relatively low. They just barely dodged the mining craze and have leveled out from a price perspective since. So here's the conclusion I think you should take away from this. The GTX 1070 Ti is still perfectly viable in 2018. Same goes obviously for the 1080, but if you can find a comparable 1070 Ti brand new for say $50 or so cheaper than its 1080 counterpart, the 1070 Ti is the better buy in my opinion. If both prices are within say 20 or 30 bucks of each other, the 1080's marginal lead becomes a little more justifiable. At the end of the day, the only way you'll probably be able to tell which card you're running in your system is if A, you have a super beefy, add-in board 1080 that's going to bring some really stellar overclocks, which is rare for Pascal, or if you have a transparent side panel and you can literally see what's written on the card. The 1070 Ti's viability in the market was always questionable from the beginning, but Nvidia's, they're competing with themselves here, and there's really nothing wrong with that so long as the prices themselves aren't all extremely high. But one thing's for sure, the 1070 Ti is one heck of a card if you can find it below 400 bucks brand new. And by the way, if you're wondering about used graphics card prices, I invite you to check out this video right here. I'm gonna brag just a little bit. You can find GTX 1070s for as low as 220 bucks on eBay. I found 2 of them for that cheap, in great condition by the way. The 1080 that I showed in this video, I bought for $300. That's literally, that's below a 1070 price. And then RX 580s, GTX 970s, and 1060s are all up there for well under 200 bucks if you know how and where to look. So if you aren't afraid to dabble in the used market, you're usually covered by the eBay buyer protection guarantee. If the thing doesn't work, just return it. There's really no risk there, just some time that you lost having to ship the thing back and wait for your money to arrive. I say go for the used market. That's my take right now. If you want to save money, if you don't want to spend 800 bucks on a new RTX card or a GTX 1080 Ti that's brand new, the used market is perfectly viable. And in all honesty, sometimes you can get even better, combinations of cards. If you want to get 2 1080s, for example, for 300 bucks a piece, 1080s and SLI, assuming the game supports SLI, will outperform a single GTX 1080 Ti. So there's that. Also, if you want to flip these cards, you can easily do that in the used market. So let me know what you think in the comments below about the used market and what you saw in this video. Thumbs up if you liked it, dislike it if you feel the complete opposite, or if you hate everything about life. You guys can click that red subscribe button if you haven't already. You can join us, become a channel member if you want to get fancy with it, and we'll catch you in the next video. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us. By the way, for those who stuck around to the very end, I want to know what you think specifically about the charts shown in this video. I purposely avoided bar charts, and I know that's going to make a few people feel uncomfortable. Maybe I'll upload a separate video talking about how frame time charts work, what you're exactly seeing, and I'm not just going to summarize it, I'll actually dedicate a whole video to that. So if you think that'll be necessary, that's fine. If you don't want to see these kinds of graphs anymore, that's fine as well. Again, this is kind of an experiment. I just feel like these kinds of graphs relay more information than the 1% and 0.1% low charts, at least in these cases, because those kind of summarize those peaks in the frame time charts, but you don't actually get to see those trends over time, especially when they're overlapped card for card. So again, leave a comment down below if you watch to the end, and let me know specifically what you think about the graphs and what I should do in the future. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.